The war did not truly end when the guns fell silent. For many, the most unsettling moment came later, when they realized that peace did not mean a return to the world they remembered. Cities stood intact but hollow. Institutions existed but had lost their authority. Societies functioned but without direction. The war was over, yet normal life did not resume, and never would. This realization struck hardest when soldiers and officials crossed into territories that had already surrendered. There was no resistance, no chaos, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was emptiness. Streets were quiet. Factories stood idle or half-functional. People moved carefully, cautiously, as if unsure which rules still applied. The absence of violence revealed something more disturbing than destruction: disorientation. For those arriving from functioning systems, this contrast was shocking. Supply chains still worked. Command structures still operated. Orders still meant something. And yet, beyond that boundary, entire societies had lost coherence. The war had not merely defeated armies. It had dissolved the frameworks that gave everyday life meaning. Authority, trust, and continuity had evaporated. This was not devastation caused by bombs alone. It was systemic exhaustion. Years of total war had consumed not only resources, but belief. Institutions had continued to exist long after their legitimacy had collapsed. By the time surrender arrived, many structures were already empty shells maintained only by habit and fear. The post-war shock came from recognizing that victory did not restore what had been lost. It revealed how deep the loss truly was. The world that emerged after the fighting was not a repaired version of the past. It was something entirely new, shaped by imbalance, dependency, and irreversible change. American forces and administrators encountered this reality almost immediately. They did not step into a vacuum that could be filled quickly. They stepped into societies that had been running on inertia for years. Restarting them required more than rebuilding bridges and factories. It required rebuilding meaning, trust, and structure. Tasks far more complex than military victory. For the defeated populations, this transition was equally jarring. The end of war did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. The familiar rhythms of control and obligation vanished overnight. In their place stood questions with no immediate answers. Who was in charge? What rules still mattered? What future was even possible? This was the true aftermath of total war. Not celebration, not closure, but shock. And that shock marked the beginning of a new era. As the first weeks of peace unfolded, it became clear that the war had not ended cleanly. It had left behind societies suspended between collapse and reconstruction. Administrative systems existed, but they no longer commanded confidence. Laws were still written, but obedience had become selective. People complied cautiously, not out of trust, but out of habit and fear of instability. The familiar structures of authority had survived the war physically, but not psychologically. This gap between form and function defined the post-war shock. Buildings stood, governments remained, and borders still appeared on maps. Yet the invisible framework that made them effective had been consumed by years of total mobilization. Decision-making had narrowed during the war, focused entirely on survival. When that pressure disappeared, there was no immediate mechanism to widen it again. Societies had forgotten how to operate without crisis. American observers quickly recognized that Reconstruction would not be a matter of replacing what had been destroyed. Much of what was missing could not be rebuilt with materials alone. Trust had eroded. Initiative had been punished. Responsibility had been centralized to the point of paralysis. People waited for orders that no longer came. And when they did come, they were met with uncertainty rather than confidence. In defeated territories, this hesitation was visible everywhere. Workers returned to factories unsure whether production would resume or why it should. Civil servants continued to report to offices without clear purpose. Local leaders avoided decisive action, fearing accountability in a world whose rules had changed overnight. The war had trained people to endure, not to decide. This created a paradox. Peace demanded initiative, creativity, and long-term planning, precisely the qualities that total war had suppressed. Survival under authoritarian pressure had rewarded conformity and caution. Now, those same traits slowed recovery. The end of fighting removed constraints but did not restore capability. The shock was intensified by comparison. Those arriving from functioning systems carried expectations shaped by continuity. They assumed that order would naturally reassert itself once violence ceased. Instead, they encountered societies where order had become performative, maintained through routine rather than belief. The difference was profound and unsettling. This realization reshaped post-war policy almost immediately. Reconstruction would have to address psychology as much as infrastructure. Stability would need to be demonstrated, not declared. Authority would need to be rebuilt slowly, through consistency rather than force. The war had ended, but the habits it created could not be dismantled overnight. For civilians, this period was marked by quiet confusion rather than relief. The certainty of wartime rules vanished, replaced by ambiguity. Choices that had been postponed for years returned all at once. What to rebuild, where to work, who to trust. The future, once narrowly defined by survival, suddenly expanded without guidance. This was the hidden cost of total war. It did not simply destroy cities. It disrupted the ability of societies to imagine normal life again. The transition from conflict to peace proved more complex than the transition from peace to war. And in that complexity lay the true beginning of the post-war world. As this uncertainty lingered, another reality became impossible to ignore. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The war had not only ended one conflict, it had reordered the world. Economic strength, technological leadership, and political influence were no longer distributed as they had been before. The post-war shock was not limited to defeated nations. It extended to allies who realized that the old equilibrium would not return. For many societies, this shift was deeply unsettling. Before the war, power had been familiar, anchored in tradition, empire, and long-standing institutions. After the war, power flowed through systems that favored scale, coordination, and economic resilience. Nations that had survived through endurance now faced a future shaped by productivity and integration rather than sacrifice alone. American presence embodied this change unmistakably. It was not expressed through occupation alone, but through capacity. Food arrived where famine had been expected. Infrastructure was repaired methodically. Administrative systems were introduced with an emphasis on continuity and predictability. This was not improvisation. It was extension of a system that had already proven itself under pressure. For local populations, this created a complex mix of relief and disorientation. Stability returned, but it came from outside. Normal life resumed, but under new rules and new dependencies. The war had ended, yet autonomy felt fragile. The world was safer, but it was no longer familiar. This realization forced a reckoning with the past. Many people understood that the war had accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken generations. Industrial concentration, technological standardization, and centralized planning were no longer temporary wartime measures. They had become defining features of the new order. The pre-war world was not waiting to be restored. It had been overtaken. Psychologically, this required adjustment. Identity had been shaped by national narratives that no longer aligned with reality. Pride, grievance, and expectation collided with a future that demanded cooperation and adaptation. The war had simplified choices into survival versus defeat. Peace reintroduced complexity, and complexity proved harder to manage. This was particularly evident in governance. Decision-making could no longer rely on authority alone. It required legitimacy rebuilt through performance. People judged systems by results, not promises. Consistency mattered more than rhetoric. Trust was earned slowly, one functioning institution at a time. The post-war shock, therefore, was not a moment. It was a process, a gradual realization that the world had crossed a threshold. What came next would not be a return, but a transition. And transitions demand patience, discipline, and a willingness to abandon assumptions that no longer apply. For those living through it, this was the most difficult lesson of all. The war had ended, but the certainty it once provided had ended with it. The future was open again, and that openness carried both opportunity and fear. As this transition unfolded, the absence of familiar reference points became one of the most destabilizing aspects of the post-war world. During the conflict, life had been governed by clear imperatives. Survival dictated behavior. Authority was unquestioned. Choices were narrow, but they were defined. Peace removed those constraints without immediately replacing them, leaving individuals and institutions uncertain about how to act. This uncertainty was especially visible in everyday life. Markets reopened without clear demand. Work resumed without clear purpose. People returned to routines that no longer made sense in the new context. Years of adaptation to scarcity and control had reshaped behavior. Initiative had been suppressed. Risk had been punished. Now, suddenly, societies were expected to innovate, rebuild, and plan for a future that felt abstract and unstable. For administrators and planners, this gap posed a serious challenge. Reconstruction could not simply restart pre-war systems. Those systems had failed to prevent catastrophe. Rebuilding them unchanged risked repeating the same vulnerabilities. Yet replacing them required legitimacy that could not be imposed. It had to be earned through consistent performance in an environment where trust had been deeply eroded. American-led Reconstruction efforts increasingly reflected this understanding. Stability was introduced gradually, through predictable processes rather than sweeping declarations. Food distribution, currency reform, and infrastructure repair were designed to demonstrate reliability before demanding confidence. This approach recognized that trust, once broken, could only be restored through repetition. Also resentment. Order returned, but it was externally supported. The familiar link between effort and outcome had been severed during the war, and rebuilding it required time. Many people struggled to reconcile personal dignity with reliance on systems beyond their control. The psychological impact of this dependency should not be underestimated. War had stripped individuals of agency. Peace did not automatically restore it. People needed evidence that their actions mattered again. That evidence came slowly, through functioning institutions, fair enforcement, and opportunities that rewarded initiative rather than obedience. This gradual restoration of agency marked a turning point in the post-war shock. It did not erase loss or trauma, but it created space for adaptation. Societies began to move from endurance to participation. The future, while uncertain, started to feel negotiable rather than imposed. Yet even as recovery took shape, the sense of irreversible change remained. The world had been reorganized around new centers of power, new expectations, and new dependencies. The post-war period was not a bridge back to the past. It was a passage into an unfamiliar landscape. Understanding this was essential for navigating what came next. The war had ended, but the conditions it created would shape global life for decades. Peace was not the restoration of normality. It was the beginning of a new normal, defined by lessons learned under extreme pressure. And for those who lived through it, that realization was as transformative as the war itself. As societies slowly adjusted to this new reality, another consequence of the post-war shock became clear. Memory itself began to change. During the conflict, experience had been compressed into urgency. Events were processed quickly, emotionally, and often without reflection. In peace, time returned, and with it came reinterpretation. What had been endured without question was now examined, compared, and judged. This process was deeply unsettling. Individuals began to reassess their own actions and choices, not in the heat of survival, but in the calm of hindsight. Decisions that once felt inevitable were now seen as contingent. Sacrifices once framed as necessary were questioned. The war, which had demanded obedience and conformity, now invited moral accounting. This shift affected institutions as well. Narratives that had sustained morale during the conflict no longer aligned with observable outcomes. Promises made under pressure lost credibility. Authority that had relied on emergency lost its foundation. Societies were forced to confront the difference between justification during war and explanation after it. The two are rarely compatible. For many, this reckoning was painful. It required acknowledging that suffering had not always produced proportionate results, and that endurance had sometimes prolonged damage rather than prevented it. The war had rewarded silence and compliance. Peace rewarded reflection, and reflection exposed contradictions that could not be ignored. American influence again played a subtle but decisive role in this phase. The emphasis on documentation, accountability, and institutional continuity encouraged societies to confront their past methodically rather than emotionally. Trials, reports, and administrative reviews were not simply punitive. They were mechanisms for rebuilding trust by demonstrating that actions now carried consequences within a stable framework. This process reshaped collective memory. The war was no longer experienced only as a series of heroic or tragic moments. It became understood as a systemic failure that required systemic response. Responsibility was redistributed from individuals alone to structures, incentives, and decisions that had shaped behavior under pressure. Psychologically, this transition marked another end of the war. The conflict ceased to exist as lived experience and became history. Memory replaced immediacy. Distance replaced urgency. This allowed societies to begin integrating the war into a broader narrative rather than remaining trapped inside it. Yet this integration was uneven. Some clung to simplified versions of the past, resistant to ambiguity. Others embraced complexity, accepting that the war had revealed uncomfortable truths about power, obedience, and vulnerability. These differences shaped post-war politics, culture, and identity in lasting ways. The post-war shock, therefore, was not confined to ruined cities or broken economies. It extended into consciousness itself. It altered how people understood authority, responsibility, and the relationship between individual action and systemic force. The war had ended, but its lessons continued to unfold. And as these lessons accumulated, one truth became increasingly difficult to deny. The world that emerged from the conflict would be defined not by what had been destroyed, but by what had been learned, and by how those lessons were applied. As these lessons began to take hold, the post-war world revealed another defining feature: permanence. Temporary measures hardened into lasting structures. Emergency coordination evolved into enduring institutions. What had been created to survive the war now shaped peace. This transition was subtle but decisive, and many did not immediately grasp how irreversible it was. International systems reflected this shift clearly. Economic frameworks, security arrangements, and political alliances formed not as short-term solutions, but as safeguards against repetition. The assumption that the world could simply demobilize and return to pre-war autonomy proved false. Interdependence had become unavoidable. Stability now depended on cooperation, enforced by structure, rather than trust alone. For societies emerging from defeat or occupation, this permanence was difficult to accept. The expectation that sovereignty would resume in familiar form collided with a reality of conditional autonomy. Recovery required alignment with systems that extended beyond national borders. Independence remained, but it operated within constraints shaped by the war's outcome. American influence was central to this new architecture, not through domination alone, but through design. Institutions emphasized predictability, transparency, and continuity, traits that had proven decisive during the conflict. These principles were exported into peacetime governance, embedding wartime lessons into the foundations of the new order. For individuals, this shift altered the meaning of security. Safety no longer derived solely from borders or armies. It depended on economic integration, political legitimacy, and institutional resilience. The war had demonstrated how quickly isolated systems could fail. The post-war world responded by binding systems together, reducing the risk of unilateral collapse. This redefinition of security carried psychological weight. It demanded trust in processes rather than personalities. It required patience rather than mobilization. For populations accustomed to crisis-driven unity, this quieter form of stability felt abstract and fragile. Yet it proved durable precisely because it was built on structure rather than emotion. Not everyone welcomed this change. Resistance emerged, often rooted in nostalgia, for a simpler narrative of power and autonomy. But the momentum of Reconstruction favored systems that could manage complexity. The war had taught that simplicity under modern conditions was an illusion. As a result, the post-war shock gradually transformed into adaptation. What initially felt foreign became familiar through repetition. Institutions earned credibility by functioning consistently. Cooperation, once seen as weakness, became associated with resilience. The world adjusted not because it forgot the war, but because it internalized its lessons. This stage marked the true conclusion of the post-war transition. The shock did not disappear. It was absorbed. The world moved forward, carrying the imprint of total war, not as trauma alone, but as instruction. The conflict had ended, but it had rewritten the rules of global life. And those rules, once established, would define the decades that followed. By the time the post-war world finally stabilized, it was clear that nothing had truly returned to normal. the silence after the fighting did not restore what had existed before. It revealed how deeply the war had reshaped everything beneath the surface. Societies moved forward, but they did so along new paths guided by structures forged under extreme pressure. This was the lasting shock of the war's end. Victory and defeat mattered, but transformation mattered more. The conflict had exposed the limits of old systems and accelerated the rise of new ones. Power shifted from tradition to capacity, from legacy to organization, from rhetoric to results. The future belonged not to those who endured the most, but to those who adapted fastest. For many, this realization arrived slowly. The post-war years were filled with attempts to reclaim familiarity, to preserve identity, to soften change. Yet each year made the truth more apparent. The world was no longer defined by what nations claimed to be, but by how effectively they functioned. Stability depended on systems that could absorb shock, coordinate complexity, and sustain trust over time. American influence in this era was not only a consequence of military victory, but of systemic continuity. The same principles that had enabled wartime endurance now shaped Reconstruction, governance, and global coordination. Predictability replaced improvisation. Process replaced impulse. The war had proven that survival in the modern world required more than courage. It required structure. For those who had lived through total war, this was both sobering and instructive. The conflict had stripped away illusions about autonomy, control, and inevitability. It revealed how quickly societies could be pushed beyond their limits, and how essential it was to build systems capable of preventing that collapse from happening again. The post-war shock, then, was not simply the realization that the war was over. It was the understanding that the world had crossed a point of no return. The conditions that produced the conflict could not be recreated without consequence. The future would be shaped by lessons learned, whether consciously or not. History often marks endings with dates and signatures. But the true end of this war unfolded over years, as societies adjusted to a reality they had not chosen, but could not escape. The silence after the guns was not empty. It was filled with new rules, new dependencies, and new responsibilities. This is how the war truly ended. Not with celebration, but with transformation. Not with closure, but with continuity of a different kind. And from that moment on, the world moved forward carrying the weight and the knowledge of what total war had made undeniable.